All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ishiko Zartem. I'm the country director for building markets, and thanks for joining us today. We're joined by our researcher, Nikolai Lido from San Francisco this morning, and I'll be shortly introducing him. Before we begin, just a quick couple of housekeeping announcements. First of all, if you've logged in as a guest, if it's possible, if you wouldn't mind changing your login to your actual name, it'll help us for recording purposes. Otherwise, if it's too difficult, no problem. I'll begin with a little bit of information about building markets, followed by the study that we've worked together with Orange Door Research on. And after that, I will hand over the floor to Nikolai. So Building Markets, we are a nonprofit organization headquartered in New York, and we seek to find, build, and connect local organizations with opportunities for growth. To date, we've supported 24,000 local businesses and civil society organizations and assisted them in winning over $1.3 billion in contracts. This has helped create over 70,000 full-time equivalent jobs in some of the world's most difficult operating environments. In Turkey in specific, we've established a network of over 700 Syrian businesses and 400 Syrian civil society organizations that work both in Turkey and in Syria. These organizations and their profiles are available on our online platforms, and which work to bring further visibility and opportunity to these organizations. But obviously, you're here to learn about the report, not hear from me. So let me move on about what we have here for you today. Within the Syria context, the security and political challenges have largely prevented NGOs from operating inside Syria. Instead, they've relied heavily on Syrian organizations who are delivering an estimated 75% of aid. This has required remote management, and with this, remote monitoring and evaluation of projects. So the objective of the study that you'll be listening to today was to take stock of current practices related to remote monitoring and evaluation of humanitarian actors who are operating across the Turkey and Syria border. The report is based on findings from interviews with 57 different bilateral and multilateral donors, NGOs, contractors, and civil society organizations involved in the crisis response. This event, as well as the development of this report, were made possible through the generous support of Global Affairs Canada, and we're deeply grateful for their support. Now, due to the large numbers in attendance, we will not be inviting questions over video. You can, however, submit your questions using the chat function, and following the presentation, I'll go through the list in order. We'll be wrapping up at 5 p.m. Turkey time on the dot, and you will have a chance to provide feedback through our feedback form at the end of this session. So with that, allow me to introduce our speaker. Nikolai Lido is from Orange Door Research, and he developed the report based on interviews conducted in the field by Peter Baumann. Nikolai holds a PhD in political science from Stanford University and is the chief data scientist with Orange Door Research. He also was an advisor to the Somalia Stability Fund and designed and analyzed large-scale representative surveys in countries across sub-Saharan Africa. Today, like I mentioned, he joins us from San Francisco. Despite it currently being 6 a.m. there, he's excited to be sharing the results of our research with you all today. Nikolai, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I guess before I jump into the slides, I just wanted to say a little bit about how I guess approached this topic. As you could tell from Ishik's introduction, I'm not a Syria expert. So I very much came to this as an outsider. I spent time with the Somalia Stability Fund as an advisor, helping them develop their remote monitoring and evaluation program, which built on some of my academic research on measurement in conflict areas, especially how to measure local economies and civilian welfare. So I worked on translating that to Somalia, which was quite a difficult situation at the time. And over the past couple years at Orange Door Research, we've worked with UNHCR and the World Bank on remote monitoring and evaluation of their programs dealing with returned refugees and IDPs. So obviously those are different contexts than Syria, but the goal was to see, well, can we take some of the lessons learned and best practices elsewhere, and through these detailed interviews with Syrian organizations, can we try to apply some of these lessons and see, are there any opportunities in Syria, or can we assess the current situation a bit? So I guess one of the main findings that we found overall is that obviously due to the security situation, local Syrian organizations are being relied on to deliver the vast majority of aid. But in the case of Syria, there wasn't really a humanitarian sector before the crisis started in 2011. So these are very young organizations. And that creates certain challenges for monitoring and evaluation, but it also creates an opportunity for long-term investment, long-term engagement with these organizations, because a lot of them have very talented, educated staff who had certain educational opportunities that were available in Syria before the war, which were not available in many other conflict countries. So over the long term, investing in those organizations is a great opportunity. Right now, the vast majority of the monitoring and evaluation effort is devoted to monitoring aid outputs to verify that aid is not being diverted. So very little attention is paid to understanding really what works and what doesn't in a systematic way, and sharing those lessons learned. The focus right now is really on preventing diversion, which is viewed as a very bad outcome for various reasons that we'll get into in a minute. So as I said, in the long term, investing in these local organizations is the biggest opportunity, but that will take time. So in the short term and medium term, we believe there's an opportunity to expand the use of mobile phone surveys and satellite data to create a broader picture of what's happening and provide some better feedback on what's working and what isn't. There's also an opportunity to increase information sharing among donors, NGOs, and all the other actors involved in the Syrian response. Right now, the security situation and certain other factors in the broader politics of the region has created a culture where organizations are extremely reluctant to share even basic information on what they're doing, which would include the types of program updates and program reports that you'd expect to find in other humanitarian crises. So I know most people on this call will be familiar with a lot of these terms, but I wanted to run through a few definitions just so that we're very clear in how they're being used here, because it turns out some of the fine-grained distinctions are important in the case of Syria. So there's two parts to monitoring and evaluation. There's monitoring and there's evaluation. The monitoring is more of a management function. It's to make sure that things are on track, that they're moving towards your goals, and it's primarily focused on tracking tangible outputs. This many bags of food was delivered, these many tools were supplied, this much cash was distributed, that type of thing. Now that's quite different from impact. For example, if you want to improve education in Syria, the monitoring of the outputs would be how many books you're supplying or how many teachers you're training. The evaluation of the impact would be what type of learning is taking place. So can you measure literacy? Can you measure certain types of cognitive tasks that the students would be expected to be able to do after the program is complete? So whereas monitoring focuses on very tangible outputs that organizations can typically hold in their hands or point to training sessions, evaluation is a longer term, what we really care about. Now, when we talk about remote monitoring and evaluation, we're really just talking about M&E activities that just don't have the physical presence of the international staff and the donors on the ground in the program areas. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to imply a security risk, but in practice, remote M&E is carried out when the security risk is too great for international staff to have a significant presence on the ground. So there's two challenges to remote M&E, a security challenge and a delegation challenge. The security challenge is that the reality of the situation may prevent the organization from conducting certain types of methods. it may just be too dangerous to go house to house and ask people information. Local authorities may prevent the use of smartphones or even pens and paper to record information because they're worried about the security risk. The other challenge, which I believe is a more fundamental challenge and a more difficult challenge, is the delegation to local organizations. So whereas in another humanitarian crisis, you may have an international NGO that has field offices, they've got full-time field staff. Those staff can receive a certain amount of training and directly implement some M&E activities, even if they hire consultants or use local NGO staff as part of their field workers. They have people on the ground who have incentives that are aligned with the international NGO that's funding the M&E. This isn't necessarily the case when you delegate to a local organization who's not a part of the international NGO. Now, that's partly because they may have limited training in M&E. Like in Syria, many of these local organizations are only a few years old. They haven't had the time or the opportunity to have experience in conducting household surveys or traditional M&E methods. But there's also a problem with their incentives. They may want to misrepresent their capacity in order to win these contracts from international NGOs. They may also have an incentive to withhold information, either because it will benefit their organization or because they're under pressure from actors on the ground to change what they're telling the international NGO. And this is very difficult to verify in these situations. So we learned in our research that Security Council Resolution 2165 turns out to be a huge influence in the daily activities of humanitarian aid in Syria. So what SCR 2165 did a few years ago is that it authorized the delivery of cross-border aid from neighboring countries, especially Turkey. And this was important because the situation in Syria was so challenging, not only with the hostility from the Assad government against humanitarian actors, but also just the proliferation of armed groups and the presence of various radical groups operating within Syria wasn't feasible. So the United Nations authorized the delivery of cross-border aid. Now, this did not guarantee humanitarian access to the groups. It just made it legal for them to operate from neighboring countries. And the result was that a lot of organizations created an information firewall between various sides of their activities. So an international NGO may have one office in Damascus serving some of the government-controlled areas near the city, while simultaneously operating a cross-border operation from Turkey. And that organization and many other organizations that we talked to expressed concern that if one aspect of their operations was known, it could jeopardize their humanitarian access for the other operation. And so Security Council 2165 allowed for a broader humanitarian response, but it also created this unintentional side effect of a culture of secrecy, which again grows largely out of a legitimate security concern in a very difficult environment. But organizations are so concerned that their actions will be misconstrued that they are very hesitant to share any information on their activities. The other outcome has been a very great concern on verifying that aid is not being diverted. So SCR 2165 renews every 6 months, and the renewal is not something that can be taken for granted. If the Syrian government complains, or neighboring countries complain, or if the US or European powers or Russia complains that SCR 2165 is actually being used to funnel resources, even food, to various armed groups, they can block the renewal of this resolution, which would then jeopardize the humanitarian response. So there's this dual focus on extensive monitoring to convince these UN actors that aid is being used where organizations say it's being used, and then also a sort of culture of, I guess, a lack of transparency on their activities for fear that it would be misconstrued or used against them by various actors. Okay, so all of this combined, the security situation, the Security Council resolution, has shaped the current remote practices in Syria. And what that means is that many donors and international NGOs recruit and train their staff entirely via Skype and WhatsApp. So many of the local staff implementing aid in Syria have never met the international NGO that's providing their funding. They communicate through these various electronic means, which makes training very difficult. It also makes establishing trust difficult. Compounding these issues is that in many areas, smartphones are not allowed. So even if Skype or WhatsApp is your main form of communication, when you're operating in certain armed group territories, you can't even use a smartphone that's your one link outside the country. So in many cases, they're using pen and paper, or in some areas, some IS-controlled areas, government or Kurdish areas, you can't even use pen and paper. So they rely on covert monitoring. Local staff will observe a food distribution or some other activity and just try to remember what they saw. So partly in response to this, third-party monitoring has become a very common tool in Syria. About 80% of the people we spoke with had experience with third-party monitoring, either on the receiving end of being monitored or on the donor end of paying for monitoring. And I'll discuss a bit more about third-party monitoring in a minute. So one of the remarkable characteristics of the Syrian conflict is really the ability of Syrians themselves to tell their stories. And again, this relates back to the educational opportunities that were available in Syria, despite the lack of openness in the government leading up to the war. Also, the fact that over 2/3 of Syrians have access to the internet through an internet-connected device. So the combination of education, also speaking a global language, Arabic, and this access to the internet is quite different from many conflicts that you'd see, especially long-running conflicts like Somalia or Afghanistan, where the stories of local people are typically told by foreigners, foreign journalists, things like this. In Syria, it really is the case where Syrians are capable of telling their own story and also capable of organizing a lot of the response. Now, social media, as we said before, has been crucial for recruiting and training staff. It's also playing an increasingly important feedback mechanism. There was an interesting anecdote that one of our interviewees told us about how a local organization was distributing food, and the community receiving the food felt it wasn't high quality. There was something wrong with it. So they documented it. They posted it to social media with a note to the donor, who was then able to check on the photos, agreed that it was low quality, and ended up replacing it with higher quality aid.
Hello?
Oh. Can people hear me okay? Sorry. Okay, so that was an interesting example of these communities, beneficiary communities, not just being passive recipients in aid, but really participating in the assistance. So in other countries, hotlines and social media have been incorporated into the formal review process of implementing partners. In Somalia, for example, the Stability Fund used these hotlines as part of their formal quarterly reviews with organizations receiving their funding. They looked at positive and negative feedback, but most importantly, they looked at the organization's responses to that feedback. So if an organization was good about responding to social media, that was a big sort of plus mark on whether they would receive additional funding in the future. Okay, so third-party monitors are extensively used in Syria. In some ways, they're considered like the gold standard of verification. Third-party monitors should be neutral, so they don't have these incentive problems that many local organizations might have. So if I'm an organization implementing an aid project and I'm also hired to monitor and evaluate my own work, I've got a very strong incentive to paint my work in the most positive possible light. And that's a very common situation, is for the aid implementer to also do the monitoring and evaluation of their own work, which is problematic. So third-party monitors can solve this issue because they theoretically don't have a stake in the success of that aid project. So they should be these neutral observers. Also, because they're a specialized organization focused just on monitoring, they could invest more in the research training and have more research experience than a typical local staff who has to juggle many tasks, such as administering an aid project. So a third-party monitor could be more specialized. And they also should have the same level of access as the local staff implementing the aid project, because that's why these third-party monitors are often selected, is that they can demonstrate a level of access to these areas. In practice, however, there are some weaknesses with third-party monitoring. They're often assumed to be neutral, but these organizations are still rooted in the local environment. They still have a desire to win contracts from donors, and that really shapes the information that they provide. A lot of times, donors don't want to get bad news, so third-party monitors feel a pressure to not deliver bad news. They also operate, among the same local authorities as the local NGOs operate, so they are under pressure there that if they want to maintain their access and their safety, they may not want to report on any diversions or misappropriation of aid on the ground. So there still is an incentive problem there. Third-party monitoring is also a surprising burden on local organizations, we learned. Although they're supposed to operate independently, in practice, they often rely on the local Syrian organizations to arrange the logistics of their trip, and even to provide the questionnaires and other monitoring tools that they'll use to assess the project, because they don't have the humanitarian background or the information on the specific project to be able to design their own monitoring. They essentially rely on the local implementing partner to provide them everything they need and also introduce them to the local communities, which is an extra burden on local staff and also reduces some of the benefits of an independent monitor. So as I said earlier, the biggest long-term opportunity is investing in local Syrian organizations. And that would be both investing resources to help them develop their humanitarian capacity and their organizations, and also investing the training and sort of long-term relationship building that would help these organizations develop and overcome some of these delegation challenges. If international organizations develop a long-term relationship with local partners, it becomes much easier to implement monitoring and evaluation on the ground. The incentives become more aligned, the local staff and the international partners have similar expectations, and working together becomes much more feasible, especially as the security situation improves. That type of long-term investment will pay off. Now, in the short and medium term, we've identified at least two opportunities for expanding the current remote M&E practices beyond this focus on just output monitoring. The one is mobile phone surveys, and the other is satellite data. So both of these methods have the advantage that they don't involve any on-the-ground activity, so they don't put staff at risk. In the case of mobile phone surveys, it's a very cost-effective method of reaching a large number of people pretty much regardless of the security situation in those areas. You could either use random digit dialing to reach a random sample across the country or across a particular province, or you could use the local implementing partner to gather some phone numbers among beneficiaries in their operating areas and contact these people directly for a more in-depth survey on the particular project. So in other areas, mobile phone surveys have provided valuable data on access to services, food security, wash, anything that you can ask someone on the phone, you can collect data on. And it's at a lower cost. And these surveys can either be automated or run out of a very small call center located outside of the country. Now, the weaknesses in mobile phone surveys are that sometimes organizations can't really act on the information. They may see that there's a need in a certain area, or that a certain group of people is not benefiting in the way they expected, but the reality on the ground means that their hands are tied, or that their budget cycles mean that they just can't react fast enough based on this information. Budget cycles also are sometimes difficult to fund these mobile phone surveys because they would be implemented and managed outside of the humanitarian area. So they could be run in Turkey or Jordan. They could even be run from Europe. And sometimes that creates some bureaucratic hurdles to the funding and management. Also, obviously, the most vulnerable people don't have cell phones. And so in many cases, they are invisible to this method. Although I would argue that broader needs assessment surveys, this is not really a problem for the people who don't have phone numbers. You can use certain statistical methods to try to estimate that bias. But if you're talking to beneficiary populations in the most dire situations, that blind spot is significant. Not being able to reach your target audience is a challenge with mobile phone surveys. So the World Food Program, across its areas of operations, but maybe especially in Syria, has this unit called the Vulnerability Assessment and Mapping Unit, MVAM. And they do impressive work using mobile phone surveys focused on food security. So using random digit dialing, they're tracking the nutritional and food security situation across every governorate in Syria right now, every month. You can see on this slide, it's a bit blurry, but each governorate is broken down and you can spot trends. And so you can see which areas are improving and which areas are in need of extra assistance. And so on the bottom, sort of the bottom left, you could see in rural Damascus with Eastern Ghouta and those areas, in October when this report was taken, that started having a deteriorating situation. And so that can help plan the response. Now, this is for food security, but there's no reason why you couldn't do this for any other sector like WASH or livelihoods or anything like that, or health. So satellite data is less commonly used among humanitarian actors, although it's becoming more prominent because new entrants into the satellite industry, so new tech startups and other providers, are creating the software and providing imagery that opens up new possibilities that are only just being explored. And right now, they're primarily being explored by stabilization actors doing infrastructure and kind of larger scale farming projects. But I believe there's opportunities to use this in a variety of monitoring for humanitarian aid. So the new opportunities are that you no longer need the specialized training and very expensive software to analyze satellite data. Companies like Planet Labs now provide the type of software where just on an internet browser, you can do a lot of the analysis that used to take days from very specialized analysts. Satellite data can also now provide pictures twice a day of anywhere on Earth. So you could even get imagery of a food distribution and count the number of trucks in the site. You could look at changes over time in farming, or a lot of activities that you wouldn't necessarily expect. For example, how many people are attending a weekly market could give you a sense of the remaining population in an area, their access to food and other services. You could look at the lights at night in a community to see if there's access to electricity. Again, it has to be something that you can see from above, from space. But with some creativity, there's a lot that can be done with this. Now, again, the weaknesses are that it can't fully substitute for on-the-ground information. You can't see in a satellite image whether people are afraid or whether they're hungry in a individual context. And also, certain populations are invisible in satellite imagery because of this. But there are huge opportunities with satellite data that haven't been fully explored yet. So here's two examples. In the top image, this is actually a picture of the Liberia-Sierra Leone border from the early 2000s. And you can see that on one side of the river, there's a lot of red, and on the other side, there's a lot of green. So the reds and the greens actually show declines and growth in crop areas. So one side of the river, there was a war. The other side, the war recently ended and there was peace. And you could see huge differences in farming practices, within a few kilometers of each other. So this nowadays is quite easy to do. You could look at any community in Syria in terms of agriculture, and you'd be able to judge whether people are tending their crops or not, whether they have access to local food supplies. This could also be used for water, sanitation, and other types of services. In Syria, some UN agencies and others are tracking the destruction of buildings, especially historical sites and other areas of cultural significance. So you can see in this bottom image that with a satellite image, it's quite easy to track that. And so even though humanitarian actors aren't involved in the reconstruction of housing, you could use this to get a real systematic picture of how many people are in need of those emergency services. If you see that 60% of buildings in a town have been destroyed, that will give you a good sense that probably at least 60% of the people are in need of emergency relief services, including shelter and food, because their assets have been destroyed. Likewise, you could also count the number of tents in a displacement camp. And again, you could even see if you're funding food distribution in a site, you could make sure that the trucks are actually there when they say they're going to be there using satellite imagery, instead of relying on third-party monitors to visit and take photos. So there are ethical challenges with remote M&E, and most of these traditional M&E methods that rely on local organizations to collect the data also rely on the assumption that local staff face lower risks because they're rooted in the local community, or they have certain ways of accessing an area that it's okay to have them collect data because it's not as risky for them as an outsider coming in. We do see trends where local staff have been increasingly targeted for kidnapping. There's been an increasingly high mortality rate for local staff in aid work. And it's a disturbing trend that forces us to question some of these ethics. And the risk threshold for remote monitoring and evaluation has to be lower than the risk threshold for delivering aid. So it is this balance that every organization has to be clear on with themselves and decide what they are comfortable with and what they can justify. That also puts more weight on methods that don't create risk for local staff, which would include mobile phone surveys and satellite data. Okay, so I'll go through our recommendations based on these findings. Yeah, as I said before, in the long term, it's going to be extremely important for international actors to provide long-term direct funding and support to local Syrian NGOs. Right now, Syrian NGOs implement the majority of aid programs, but receive, I think, less than 1% of the funding. That is going to be increasingly problematic, especially as the security situation improves and a large-scale reconstruction effort gets started, the international community is really going to need capable local actors who are conversant with these international humanitarian norms and with monitoring and evaluation practices. And so the time to start that investment is now. So donors and NGOs should also fund proof of concepts about using these technologies, mobile phone surveys, satellite data. There's other technologies possible like barcode tracking. It's difficult to jump straight in to large-scale data collection using these methods because organizations often have a hard time figuring out how to respond to the information that comes back, especially these organizational issues of, well, who's in charge of this program, who's in charge of responding to the findings of the mobile surveys to change our humanitarian response? How do we get the budget for these things? We found that it's often easier to start small with a pilot project, and if that project fills the organization's needs to some extent, then they can scale it. And this was the case with World Food Program with their mobile phone survey unit. They started small and have successfully scaled it. We think there's an opportunity for other organizations of various sizes to start similar programs. So I mentioned earlier that there's difficulty in sharing lessons learned and even sharing basic information on who's doing what and where. And that's a lot of that has to do with the security situation. A lot of that has to do with Security Council resolution. So we think there's an opportunity to use some type of organizing body like OCHA to come up with a standard protocol for what information should be shared in a way that won't jeopardize humanitarian access. And if all the major NGOs and donors follow this protocol, then none of them will be singled out for their activities. And this could be an expansion of an existing system, like the Humanitarian Response Portal, or it could be a separate Syria-specific system that maybe restricts access in certain ways. But this type of information sharing could be increased in Syria. So the next recommendation has to do with third-party monitors. We talked about some of the strengths and weaknesses of third-party monitoring. One of the common complaints that we heard from local implementing partners was that third-party monitors weren't adhering to humanitarian principles necessarily, and that they also weren't providing local implementers with a chance to respond or even see the monitoring reports. So when third-party monitors would visit a beneficiary community, sometimes they would create the wrong impression. Locals weren't entirely clear on who the third-party monitors were, who they were working for, what their goals were, because they weren't properly identifying themselves and explaining their mission. And then the local organizations felt like they were being maybe unfairly criticized, which hurt the trust between the international donors and the local implementers. So increasing the flow of communication, creating more professional standards among third-party monitors, I think would produce a better working relationship, both with third-party monitors and between the international NGOs and their implementing partners. So the last recommendation has to do with something we heard from interviewees about the reality on the ground. Many of these areas where aid projects are being delivered are governed by local administrative councils. So armed groups have rapidly shifting territories, but in many cases, the local community has come together and they've organized themselves. These local administrative councils are important for identifying beneficiaries, for securing access for the local NGOs, and in some cases, even for collecting, monitoring, and evaluation data and providing feedback. They play a valuable role. These councils also create a risk of aid diversion and corruption. Stabilization actors have collected what they call atmospherics data on these councils. So they collect information and decide, okay, these councils are groups we can work with. Those councils create too much risk of diversion or corruption, we can't work directly with them. We think the humanitarian community could adopt this approach, especially the donor community. Right now, it's an ad hoc situation where donors impose their own requirements. Some donors forbid implementing partners from working with local administrative councils. Other donors allow the local implementers to use their judgment, but there's no systematic approach to this. So again, we think that sort of bringing this out in the open, acknowledging that these actors play a vital role in many cases, but that it's a decision that has to be made whether or not to engage directly with them. Okay, so that's it for the presentation, but I look forward to hearing your questions.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Nikolai. We'll be taking questions shortly. In the chat, please feel free to write down your questions and we'll go through them from the top. While everyone's getting a chance to just draft what they have in mind, let me just quickly remind everyone that our report that this research is referring to was just published today, and my colleague Jamie will be sharing the link with you all. You'll be able to access it in the chat box. Also, thank you very much. I see CCSD has just shared the satellite imaging software link. That's fantastic. That's very helpful. That's wonderful. Thank you. So Nikolai, let me begin while the questions are coming in. You mentioned that monitoring to prevent aid diversion, it's not necessarily wrong, but it's being done at the expense of evaluating outcomes. So what do you think an organization, whether a local organization inside Syria, or it could be also an international organization who wants to improve their methodology, what type of straightforward steps do you think such organizations could take so that while still being compliant to their donor regulations, they do also not neglect the need to evaluate for outcomes as well?
Syrian organizations and donors face a tricky situation right now. We were actually struck by how well the aid monitoring is working when it comes to diversion. Donors were satisfied that they were believed that the aid wasn't being diverted. Local organizations felt that they were capable of demonstrating this to their donors. It took a lot of effort, but everyone agreed that it was important, and they seem to be doing a good job at that. So that shouldn't, we're not arguing that should be reduced or that that's misguided to focus so much on aid diversion, but it does create a challenge. Right now, local organizations are extremely stretched. They're not only implementing these projects, but they're submitting detailed reports for every donor that funds them. And a lot of these local organizations are juggling grants from 6 or 8 different international donors who each have different reporting requirements. One of the recommendations we considered was some way of donors to streamline their reporting requirements, which would then free up some capacity from local organizations to focus on other activities. But talking with donors, we realized this was probably not feasible, since in many cases these requirements are set by the U.S. government, or in the case of USAID, or the UK Parliament. So this focus on preventing aid diversion and reporting to multiple donors is probably just a fact of life for the short and medium term. So the challenge is, how do you expand beyond that? And really, there's only 2 ways that we can see. One is to use some additional methods that don't require any additional capacity from local staff. And so that could be mobile phone surveys or satellite imagery, which can be done from outside of the country. So the local implementing partner doesn't need to use their resources and time to do that. 2 is to somehow increase the capacity of local organizations so that they can handle the monitoring to prevent aid diversion while also doing additional M&E activities. And that can really only happen in the current situation with an increased investment in the organizational capacity and training of these local partners. Right now, they receive funds to implement a project, but they're not receiving any funding for their broader organizational development. So they're really kind of living day to day, doing what they need to for this project, but they don't have the spare capacity to invest in the future, which would allow them to do a variety of M&E activities on top of the basic monitoring.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikolai. So turning to some of the questions that have started to come in, there's a question related to outcome monitoring. So you spoke of evaluations as being usually for the outcome level, but what about outcome monitoring? The question specifically refers to the presence of outcome monitoring, that it's being done consistently and to varying degrees of quality, but the application or use of these evaluation or outcome monitoring findings might be haphazard. Do you have any thoughts on that, Nikolai?
Yeah, so I guess, at least for the purpose of of this talk, I would consider anything that focuses on outcomes, which would be the sort of substantive improvements that we care about. So rather than food distribution, the outcome would be nutrition and health or something like that. I would, for the purpose of this talk, I would call that an evaluation, or at least some type of evaluation. I think the biggest challenge with evaluations, like the person pointed out, is how do you use this information? In my experience working with NGOs over the years, I do think that there is a tendency, for a lot of reasons, where these types of exercises are used to kind of check the box to satisfy donors or because of some reporting requirement. They're really learning from an evaluation, or learning from these measured outcomes is really challenging in the aid sector. And that's something that that's a challenge not just in Syria, but everywhere that I've seen. Unfortunately, I don't have good answers for that, because it really depends on an organization by organization basis. But that's certainly, I think, a major area that needs improvement in the aid sector in general.
Another question that's come in is related to measuring impact. So the question goes, how can we measure if a beneficiary moves from relying on food assistance to building resilience and no longer needs this type of assistance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I could provide a simple answer to that. A lot of it, there are fairly short questionnaires which I've used in the past, which seem to work fairly well on food security and nutrition, that are pretty standard from World Food Program and others. I think World Food Program does a pretty good job of measuring nutrition and also coping mechanisms. So one way to measure, I guess, resilience is by looking at how people are changing their behavior based on certain shocks and things like that. It's a challenge. Measuring it depends a lot on the scope of the particular aid project. I noticed the word move in that, and I know that in the question, move was used to refer to kind of a personal transition from being food insecure to being more resilient. But I think population movement, the physical movement of people, is an additional challenge. So how do you track a beneficiary population when displacement is incredibly high, and especially repeated displacement is high, as it is in Syria? What's interesting there is that WhatsApp and other apps now will give a person one number, and even if they cross the border into Turkey or somewhere like that, and they have to change SIM cards or or have other sort of sources of instability in their life, you can often contact the same person using their WhatsApp number. So that's something that local Syrian organizations have already discovered and are using on an ad hoc basis. But in terms of tracking resiliency and improvements in a beneficiary over time, using that type of mobile data collection, having local partners always collect people's phone numbers and WhatsApp numbers whenever possible, and then contacting them over time to see how their situation is changing is one way of understanding that.
Great. I was actually just going to mention, I remember one of our conversations where you mentioned that I think it was in the Somalia Stability Fund, that it was a requirement that every beneficiary of aid also provide their phone number.
Yes. So this was a really interesting thing that that the Stability Fund did. This was back in 2015. I think it started being a requirement, and they would fund the Stability Fund basically channels foreign aid from Britain, the European Union, Norway, a few other donors to try to have a more coordinated investment strategy in rebuilding Somalia. So they fund dozens of local organizations across the country, and everyone they fund has to collect phone numbers from all of their beneficiaries. And these phone numbers go into a central database. And this proved to be really valuable because, one, we could reach out directly to people and ask them, did you receive this aid? What do you think of this organization? But over time, we also built up a fairly large database of people where if a new organization was moving into the area to do a different project, we already had a group of people that we could call. So if we wanted to do a baseline needs assessment, maybe these people had already received food assistance, but an agriculture program was about to start. We already had a database of numbers where we could call and see what the baseline situation was and follow up with them over time. So every additional organization that receives funding just added to this database. It would be great if there was something like this in Syria, or if large donors had this requirement where obviously it wouldn't be possible in every case, but whenever possible, to collect basically just any numbers you can. It turns into a very valuable resource for monitoring and evaluation, and also needs assessment and designing programs moving forward.
Thank you, Nikolai. We have a question related to how donors might be viewing remote management and remote monitoring, but I'll actually ask guest 13, the person behind this question, to attend our we have an event next week, actually, as Building Markets, where we'll be joined by a few donors for a similar virtual roundtable with Syrian civil society and international stakeholders. And with the donors on the panel, actually, the question that you have of what type of programming modality they prefer, they would certainly be the right people to ask. Nikolai's scope of work related to this project was to examine what type of remote monitoring evaluation exists, and perhaps some ways to do it better, particularly given short and medium term restrictions on access. But in terms of what would be a preferred programming modality, that will depend on the donors. And like I said, we'll have an event on June 7th, again using Blue Jeans. And if you are signed up for our newsletter, you'll also be receiving the invite for that event. Okay, thank you. I see that the event is being clarified on chat. Great. I'll give a couple more seconds if there's any more questions that are set to come through. Any more questions for Nikolai? Okay. Well, in that case, Nikolai, thank you so much for being available. I know it's bright and early for you, but I hope that this was as useful for our participants as it was for me personally. And we'll also make sure to make the presentation and the report available to you afterwards, both online and through email as well. I'd also like to invite everyone to please fill out our feedback survey. We'll be sharing a link to it. If you could please fill that out, it would be very useful for us as Building Markets, just to let us know how we did and what we can do better for next time. Thank you very much to everyone, and good luck with the rest of your work. Thanks, Nikolai. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for having me. Bye.